You're sitting in an airplane cruising at 40,000 feet. Outside the window, the air pressure is about 1/4 of what it is at sea level. If the cabin were exposed to that environment, you'd lose consciousness in seconds. But inside, you're comfortable. Maybe your ears pop during climb and descent. Maybe you feel slightly different than on the ground. But you can breathe normally, move around, even sleep. The cabin is pressurized. But here's what most people don't realize. It's not pressurized to sea level. It's pressurized to the equivalent of about 6,000 to 8,000 feet altitude. That's the elevation of a mountain resort. Noticeably thinner air than you're used to at home. About 25% less oxygen available per breath than at sea level. Aircraft manufacturers could pressurize cabins to sea level. The technology exists, but they deliberately choose not to. Why would engineers design a system that gives passengers less oxygen than necessary? The answer involves structural engineering, metal fatigue, and a calculated trade-off between passenger comfort and aircraft longevity. To understand the decision, you need to understand what pressurization does to an aircraft structure. An aircraft fuselage is essentially a pressure vessel, like a soda can or a submarine, but designed to contain higher pressure inside than outside. Every time the aircraft climbs to cruise altitude, the fuselage inflates slightly. Every time it descends, it deflates. This pressure cycling creates stress on the structure. The aluminum skin stretches outward. Rivets and joints experience tension. The entire fuselage expands by a measurable amount at cruise altitude. The pressure difference between inside and outside is called the differential pressure. At 40,000 feet with a cabin altitude of 8,000 feet, this differential is about 8.5 pounds per square inch, or roughly 0.6 bar. That might not sound like much, but consider that this pressure acts on every square inch of the fuselage interior. A typical narrow-body aircraft has tens of thousands of square inches of pressurized surface. The total outward force is enormous, measured in millions of pounds. Now imagine increasing that pressure, differential by pressurizing to sea level instead of 8,000 feet to the sea. Level pressure is about 14.7 psi. At 40,000 feet, outside pressure is about 2.7 psi. The differential would be roughly 12 psi instead of 8.5 psi. That's a 40% increase in the force, trying to blow the fuselage apart. The structure would need to be significantly stronger to handle this increased load. Stronger means thicker aluminum skin, heavier reinforcement, more robust joints. All of that means more weight. In aviation, weight is the enemy. Every kilogram of structural weight is a kilogram that can't be passengers, cargo, or fuel. Heavier aircraft burn more fuel, have shorter range, and cost more to operate. The 8,000-foot cabin altitude represents a carefully calculated balance. It's low enough that healthy passengers experience no significant problems. It's high enough that the structural requirements remain manageable. But there's another factor beyond weight: fatigue. Metal structures don't just fail from single overloads. They fail from repeated stress cycles. Every time the fuselage pressurizes and depressurizes, microscopic damage accumulates. This is called metal fatigue. Aircraft are designed for a specific number of pressurization cycles. A typical commercial jet might be certified for 60,000 or more flight cycles. After that, inspection requirements increase dramatically, and eventually the aircraft must be retired. Higher pressure differentials accelerate fatigue damage. The stress range on each cycle is larger. Cracks propagate faster. The aircraft reaches its fatigue limit sooner. By limiting cabin altitude to 8,000 feet, engineers extend the operational life of the aircraft. The same fuselage can fly more cycles before fatigue becomes a concern. This isn't just about safety margins. It's about economics. Airlines need aircraft that can fly for 25 to 30 years before retirement. There's historical context here that's worth understanding. In the early days of pressurized flight, engineers didn't fully understand metal fatigue. The de Havilland Comet, the world's first commercial jet airliner, suffered catastrophic in-flight breakups in 1954. Investigation revealed that fatigue cracks had developed around the square windows, propagating until the fuselage failed explosively. The Comet disasters led to fundamental changes in aircraft design. Windows became round or oval to reduce stress concentrations. Fatigue testing became mandatory, and pressure differentials were carefully limited to extend fatigue life. The 8,000-foot cabin altitude standard emerged from this painful learning. It's not arbitrary. It's the result of decades of engineering experience and the understanding that every additional PSI of pressure has cumulative structural consequences. So what happens to passengers at 8,000-foot cabin altitude? The reduced pressure means less oxygen is available with each breath. At sea level, the partial pressure of oxygen in your lungs is about 100 millimeters of mercury. At 8,000 feet equivalent, it's about 70 millimeters. Your blood oxygen saturation drops slightly. At sea level, a healthy person typically shows 97 to 99% saturation. At 8,000-foot cabin altitude, this might drop to 93 to 95%. For healthy individuals, this is well within the body's tolerance. You might notice subtle effects: slight fatigue, drier skin from the low humidity, reduced taste sensitivity, which is why airline food often seems bland, mild dehydration if you don't drink enough water. But for most people, these effects are minor inconveniences, not health risks. However, passengers with respiratory or cardiovascular conditions may experience more significant effects. This is why airlines recommend that passengers with certain medical conditions consult their doctors before flying. Some may need supplemental oxygen during flight. The alcohol effect is real too. Alcohol has a stronger effect at altitude due to the lower oxygen environment. One drink at cruise altitude can feel like 2 or 3 at sea level. The combination of altitude, alcohol, and dehydration explains why some passengers become unexpectedly intoxicated on flights. There are newer aircraft that challenge the traditional 8,000-foot standard. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner features a cabin altitude of 6,000 feet during cruise. This is possible because the 787's fuselage is made primarily from carbon fiber composite rather than aluminum. Composite materials handle pressure cycling differently than aluminum. They're more resistant to fatigue in some respects, allowing for higher pressure differentials without the same structural penalties. The 787 can maintain lower cabin altitude while still meeting fatigue life requirements. Passengers on 787s often report feeling less fatigued after long flights. The higher oxygen availability, combined with improved humidity systems on the aircraft, genuinely improves the passenger experience. The Airbus A350 similarly uses composite construction and offers improved cabin altitude compared to older aluminum aircraft. As composites become more common in aviation, we may see cabin altitudes continue to decrease towards sea level. But even composites have limits. Complete sea level pressurization would still require structural weight penalties. The improvement from 8,000 feet to 6,000 feet is meaningful. The improvement from 6,000 feet to sea level would be incremental at best, while the weight cost would be significant. There's also the question of emergency decompression. If a window fails or the fuselage is breached at cruise altitude, the cabin rapidly equalizes to outside pressure. This is an explosive decompression, and it's extremely dangerous. The severity of explosive decompression depends partly on the initial pressure differential. A cabin at sea level pressure would have a more violent decompression event than one at 8,000 feet. More force, faster airflow, greater risk of structural damage propagating from the initial breach. By maintaining higher cabin altitude, the consequences of decompression are slightly less severe. It's not a primary design driver, but it's another factor in the engineering calculation. The oxygen masks that drop during decompression are designed for the current pressure differential assumptions. They provide supplemental oxygen to keep passengers conscious until the aircraft can descend to breathable altitude. typically below 10,000 feet. Pilots have about 15 to 30 seconds of useful consciousness at 40,000 feet without supplemental oxygen. This is why oxygen masks deploy automatically and why pilots immediately begin emergency descent if decompression occurs. So the 8,000-foot cabin altitude is a compromise, but a well-reasoned one. It's high enough to reduce structural stress, extend fatigue life, and save weight. It's low enough that healthy passengers experience minimal effects. It represents a century of aviation engineering learning, from the Comet disasters to modern composite aircraft. The next time your ears pop during descent, remember what's happening. The aircraft is transitioning from 8,000-foot equivalent pressure to ground-level pressure. That pressure difference, about 25% less than full sea-level pressurization, is the reason the aircraft can fly tens of thousands of cycles over decades of service. It's the reason the aluminum doesn't fatigue prematurely. It's the reason the aircraft remains light enough to be economical. It's the reason you can fly at all. Engineering is full of these invisible trade-offs. The perfect solution isn't always possible. The best solution balances competing requirements. And sometimes, giving passengers slightly thinner air is the price of giving them flight at all. Speaking of cabin environment, the air you breathe on an aircraft goes through a fascinating journey. It's bled from the jet engines, processed, and recirculated in ways most passengers never consider. I've covered how that works in another video.